First things first, there will be spoilers in this video. If you haven't played Planescape Torment yet, well, you've been warned. Second things second, I'm going to talk about the game now, and boy is there a lot to say. Way more than I'll have time for. Planescape Torment has a well-deserved reputation as either one of the best written games ever or the best written game ever. But since this is creepy, obsessive nerdlove, it's not enough for you to like the game. You have to like it in the same way I do, and I'm going to tell you how. Step 1 is to appreciate the depth of the game, and in order to do that, we need to come up with a working definition of the word depth. It won't be easy. It's a word with a positive connotation, but a vague denotation. In order to describe what depth is, I'm going to tell you what depth does, or at least what it does in my definition of the word. Depth makes you play the game as though you were actually there. But wait, you say, aren't all games supposed to do that? Sure, they're supposed to, but very few of them actually pull it off. The experience of playing all games includes, to some level or another, the awareness of their own artificiality. If you've ever picked Paragon because you always pick Paragon, then you know what I mean. There's a constant running tension between the mechanics by which the game world operates and the mechanics by which the thing that it's simulating would actually operate. A game with depth is one that's both complex and well realized enough to minimize or disguise this tension. To demonstrate what I mean, let's look at the first part of Planescape. A well-designed game like this one will use the first half hour or so of gameplay to acclimate the player to the rules of its world. On the most basic level, this is left click to move, I for inventory, J for journal, and so forth. On a more advanced level, it means giving players clues as to the tone and style of the place they're inhabiting. In the first half hour of Planescape Torment, these clues indicate that the expectations you take into a typical game will not necessarily be reliable here. For example, you wake up on a slab in the Dustmen's mortuary, and the first things you learn about the Dustmen is that they're a religious cult that worships death, and whose mortuary is full of shambling, groaning zombies. In most games, your first job would be to kill all of the zombies you come across, and then kill all of the Dustmen you come across, and then escape from this obviously evil place. And you can do that if you want, but the game finds ways to signal to you that that's not how things work here. The enemies are not aggressive, and clicking on them begins dialogue instead of combat. The first Dustman you talk to dispels the assumption that his religion is filled with one-dimensional evil creeps, and the next few people you talk to introduce you to one of the more unique aspects of this game, which is that its dialogue sections are some of the most difficult. It's possible to fail conversations in Planescape, and not failing them requires that you pay close attention to both yourself and your surroundings. In other words, they require you to roleplay. They require you to behave as though you were actually there, not as though you were playing a computer game. Which, if you'll remember, is my working definition of what depth does. My working definition of what depth is the quality of having practical and emotional complexity comparable to that of real life. If you have that, then you have depth. And if you have depth, then I will play your game differently than I would most, and I will experience it differently than I would most. And to illustrate and explain the way I played Planescape Torment, I'm going to make use of my most ham-fisted segue ever. Are you ready? Here it comes. The Holocaust. Yeah, that one. Did you know that all those World War II shooters they made a while back were based on an actual historical war? And that the villains from the Indiana Jones movies were based on an actual group of people? I do, because I learned it in high school, when we went on a field trip to the Holocaust Museum in downtown LA. The museum showed us how the Jews were demonized, herded from their homes into ghettos, herded from ghettos into concentration camps, and herded from concentration camps into gas chambers. It was powerful stuff, but it also left me confused. The museum answered the question, what happened to the Jews? Which is a good question, but for me it led to a follow-up. What happened to the Germans? How is it that an entire country full of otherwise normal people, with a culture not so different from our own, collectively perpetrated this terrible crime? The only explanation I ever got was something about the economy being bad, and then a guy with a funny mustache shouted a bunch of gibberish at big crowds of people who then concluded that killing millions of Jews was a good idea for some reason. If I had read a novel with that as its plot, I would have considered it silly and unrealistic. So what happened to the Germans? I never got an answer to that question in school, partly because I didn't yet know how to ask it. But this question is important, and in my opinion its omission is too common when we teach the history of the period. It's easy and even flattering to imagine yourself as the victim of an injustice. There's an innocence and a nobility to victimhood. But my high school classmates and I were mostly rich white Christians. Statistically, we were much more likely to have been silent or even vocal collaborators in the Holocaust than victims of it. What if, instead of living in America now, I had lived in Germany in the 30s? Of course, I'd like to think I would have been one of the good ones. I'd like to think I would have been Oskar Schindler. But I have to acknowledge the possibility that I might have just kept my head down and my mouth shut and gone along with it. Because that's the easy thing to do, because that's the safe thing to do. And because I've done it before. Thinking back to when I was younger, there was more than one time when I witnessed homophobia and didn't object to it, or worse, participated in it. I feel bad about that now, but I didn't at the time. At the time it seemed normal. At the time it seemed like what I was supposed to be doing. Effective demagogues don't spout gibberish. They spout specious reasoning backed up by plausible-sounding lies, and people are persuaded by them for a reason. Not because they're hateful by nature, but because they're glib and incurious, because they accept the logic of bigotry as it's presented to them. Learning this was an unsettling experience for me. It forced me to confront the possibility that I may not be as good a person as I always assumed I was, and that the differences between the real me and a hypothetical Nazi me are not as clear as I'd like them. So, on that cheerful note, back to Planescape Torment. Over the course of your journey, you won't meet your hypothetical evil self. You'll meet your literal evil self. You'll meet previous incarnations of the Nameless One that, when placed in different circumstances, did horrible things. There's no comforting distance between you and them. You were them, and it was you who did those things. In many ways, the dilemma of the game is how can I avoid doing them again? How can I be a better person? And because this game has depth, as I've defined it earlier in the video, you don't approach these questions by way of contrived in-game logic. You approach them as though they were real. I've never identified more strongly with a character than I did with the Nameless One. Not because I knew he was the player character, or because the camera was centered on him, or because his was the face on the creation screen, but because I could see myself in him, and vice versa. That's why I consider this game to be morally good. That seems like a weird thing to say about a game, right? But I say it for a reason. Through subverting the conventions of its medium, it encourages players to carefully consider themselves and their own actions. It takes away the safety net of predictability and convention, of a world where the right thing to do and the obvious thing to do are typically one and the same. It recognizes that being a good person takes more than just good intentions. It takes empathy, critical thinking, and self-reflection, and then gives the player a chance to exercise those virtues. Now that I've finished tongue-bathing Planescape Torment, I'd like to take a moment to shift gears from creepy obsessive nerdlove back to tasteful understated nerdrage. You've probably already guessed why I'm making this video now. It's because of the Tides of Numenera Kickstarter, which aims to be the spiritual successor to Planescape Torment. I've already backed it, and you should too. There are still stretch goals to go. In fact, this is the second of inXile's games I've backed, which I believe legally gives me a voting majority on their board, so they have to do what I say. And what I'm gonna say will be rambling and borderline incomprehensible, so strap in. There's a play I like called The History Boys. Never mind what it's about, just know that at one point in the play, one of the characters reads a poem, and then says, "In other words," another character stops him and points out that if what he just read is art, then there are no other words. Any attempt to paraphrase the work will unavoidably lose some of its essential meaning. Since everyone likes sentences that follow the form "art is blank," I'll put the word irreducible in there. Art is irreducible. Try to summarize it or explain it in any way, and you'll lose something in the summary or in the explanation. There are no other words. Unless you're making a YouTube video. Videos get the whole thing, no exceptions. With this in mind, know that there are two Planescape Torments. One is the game that actually exists, that came out in 1999 and that you can buy and play right now. The other is the game we remember, the game we evangelize for, the game we hold up as a high watermark for the medium. This is the mythical Planescape, the in other words Planescape. And very often those other words are these: what can change the nature of a man? In any discussion of Planescape, it won't be long before this question comes up. Which is fine, it's an important part of the game, but it's not all of it, it's not an encapsulation of it, it's only what it is in other words. Which is why I'm uneasy at the presence of a similar question that keeps popping up in the marketing for the new Kickstarter. What does one life matter? Now that's an interesting question. It could serve as part of a good game. It doesn't serve as all of a good game. If Tides of Numenera ends up as a bunch of high-concept parables about this one question, I'm gonna be disappointed. Planescape wasn't good because it asked ambitious philosophical questions. It was good because asking ambitious philosophical questions was just one of the many things it did well. And I'm fine if the new game features this question, I just don't want it to orbit it too closely. I don't want a spiritual successor to the mythical Planescape. I want a spiritual successor to the real one. And that's probably what I'm gonna get. I don't think Inexile is gonna fuck this up. They've assembled a team that I have reason to be confident in. But I also worry, because that's what I do. It's very stressful to have unreasonably high expectations for everything like I do. So I worry, and when I worry I lecture because that's how I am. It's my nature. What can change the nature of a C-level YouTube personality? Nothing. My nature is fine the way it is. I don't want to change it. Coming up. I'm not sure. I'm having trouble deciding what to do next, so I'm gonna run a couple options by you. Option 1 is more of the same. More videos with a different topic each time. I'm gonna be doing this anyway, but I might alternate it with something else, which is Mass Effect commentary. Huh? What I mean is that I would do something for the Mass Effect series similar to what Goose Goose did with Half-Life 2. It's difficult to explain what this is. It's best that you watch what inspired it, which is Goose Goose's videos. There's a link to one of them in the description. The reason I ask is because it would be a big, multi-video project, and I don't want to start it without checking to see if it'd be something anyone is interested in. Anyway, that's it. I'll be watching the comments to see what people think. See you soon.